On the morning of February 8th, 1945, Sergeant Joe Mason crouched behind the quarter-inch steel plating of his M16 Halftrack, peering into the suffocating density of the Luzon jungle. The air was thick enough to chew, heavy with the scent of rotting vegetation, cordite, and the nervous sweat of the infantrymen dug into the foxholes around him. Mason wasn't an infantryman, and his vehicle wasn't supposed to be here. The M16, multiple gun motor carriage, was a beast born to hunt the sky, designed to shred the aluminum skin of diving Zeros and Bettys at 5,000 feet. But there were no planes in the sky today. There was only the green wall of the tree line and the terrifying, rhythmic chanting rising from deep within the foliage. It was a sound that every Marine and GI in the Pacific Theater had come to dread, more than the snap of a sniper's bullet. The prelude to a Banzai charge. At that moment, Mason and his crew did the unthinkable. They didn't aim up at the clouds. They cranked the heavy Maxim turret level with the earth, depressing the 4 heavy barrels until they pointed directly into the undergrowth. What happened in the next few minutes would not just change the outcome of a skirmish. It would fundamentally alter the psychology of the Pacific War, transforming a machine of aerial defense into the most terrifying instrument of anti-personnel destruction the Japanese Imperial Army had ever faced. To understand the sheer magnitude of this moment, we must first understand the desperate stalemate that defined the Battle of Luzon in early 1945. General Douglas MacArthur had returned to the Philippines, fulfilling his famous vow, but the liberation was rapidly descending into a bloodbath. Facing the Americans was General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, a commander who knew he could not win a conventional war against American industrial might. Instead, Yamashita chose a strategy of attrition. He withdrew his forces into the mountainous, jungle-choked interior of Luzon, creating a labyrinth of caves, tunnels, and fortified ridges. His goal was not victory, but to make the American advance so costly in blood that Washington would sue for peace. The Japanese soldiers, indoctrinated in the ancient code of Bushido, viewed surrender as the ultimate disgrace. They were not fighting to survive. They were fighting to die well, taking as many Americans with them as possible. This philosophy manifested most brutally in the Banzai charge, a human wave attack where hundreds, sometimes thousands of soldiers would surge forward with fixed bayonets, disregarding their own safety to overwhelm American lines through sheer weight of numbers and ferocity. For the American infantrymen, the GI armed with an M1 Garand or a Thompson submachine gun, these attacks were the stuff of nightmares. A standard rifleman could only fire so fast. When faced with a wall of screaming humanity emerging from the night, the mathematics of combat turned against the Americans. There were simply too many targets and not enough seconds to reload. The psychological toll was immense. American troops were exhausted, their nerves frayed by the constant threat of infiltration and the knowledge that their enemy did not fear death. The U.S. commanders realized that standard infantry tactics were failing to dislodge the dug-in Japanese defenders without sustaining unacceptable casualty rates. They needed a game changer. They needed firepower that didn't just suppress the enemy, but obliterated the very concept of a human wave. They found their answer in a weapon system that was currently sitting idle waiting for enemy aircraft that no longer existed. Enter the M16 multiple gun motor carriage, a vehicle that looked like a piece of industrial farming equipment modified for the apocalypse. Built on the chassis of the rugged M3 Halftrack, the M16 was the mobile platform for the M45 quad mount. This was not a subtle weapon. It consisted of 4 M2 Browning .50 caliber heavy machine guns mounted in a powered turret. The Madus, as the M2 was affectionately known, was already a legendary weapon, firing a thumb-sized projectile capable of punching through engine blocks and concrete walls. But the quad mount took this power and multiplied it by 4. Powered by a chaotic, dedicated gasoline generator mounted on the rear of the turret, the system allowed the gunner to traverse and elevate the guns faster than a human could track a target. It was designed to catch a Zero fighter moving at 300 miles per hour against a human running at 10 miles per hour. It was overkill on a cosmic scale. The decision to bring these anti-aircraft tracks to the front lines of the infantry war was born of necessity, but it was executed with lethal creativity. The doctrine was simple. If the Japanese wanted to use their bodies as weapons, the Americans would introduce them to the ultimate machine. The M16s were deployed along the Villa Verde Trail and the ragged ridges overlooking the Cagayan Valley. The crews, like Sergeant Masons, were initially skeptical. Firing heavy caliber rounds into dense jungle seemed like a waste of ammo. They worried about overheating the barrels, about the difficult terrain bogging down the half tracks, and about their exposed positions in the open turrets. But as the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched across the Kogon grass, the reality of their new mission became clear. Before we witnessed the carnage of that first engagement, I want to ask you a question. In the history of warfare, do you think the outcome of a battle is decided more by the morale of the soldiers or the technological superiority of their weapons? Pause for a moment and let us know your thoughts in the comments below, because the event we are about to describe suggests a terrifying answer. The Japanese attack began with a deceptive quiet, followed by the roar of officers shouting orders and the distinct high-pitched crack of Arisaka rifles. Then came the scream, "Tenno Heika Banzai! Long live the Emperor!" From the tree line, a wave of khaki-clad soldiers erupted, bayonets glinting in the tropical sun. They moved with a terrifying unity, a singular organism of violence intent on closing the distance before the Americans could react. In any previous engagement, this was the moment of maximum danger for the U.S. troops. But today, the infantry stayed low. They didn't fire. They waited. Sergeant Mason kicked the pedal that controlled the turret's rotation. The electric motors whined, swinging the 4 heavy barrels toward the onrushing tide. He squeezed the butterfly trigger between the spade grips. The result was not a sound, but a physical sensation. A continuous, earth-shaking roar that sounded like canvas ripping, amplified 1,000 times. The Quad 50 didn't just fire, it erupted. With all 4 guns cycling, the M16 was spitting out lead at a rate of over 2,000 rounds per minute. That is more than 30 rounds every single second. These were not small rifle bullets. These were half-inch slugs of copper-jacketed steel, traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second. The effect on the Japanese charge was instantaneous and horrifyingly absolute. The front rank of the Banzai charge didn't fall, they simply evaporated. The kinetic energy of thousands of .50 caliber rounds hitting human bodies created a phenomenon the troops grimly called the Red Mist. Limbs were severed, torsos were shattered, and men were thrown backward as if hit by a speeding truck. The jungle foliage behind them was mowed down as if by a giant invisible scythe. Trees were sawed in half. Thick kogon grass was reduced to mulch, and the very earth was churned up into a cloud of dust and debris. The Japanese soldiers, trained to ignore fear, trained to run through machine gun fire, found themselves facing a wall of physics that no amount of courage could overcome. The charge, which had begun with such ferocity, was extinguished in less than 30 seconds. Silence returned to the clearing, ringing in the ears of the American crew, broken only by the mechanical hum of the turret's generator and the sizzling of the 4 red-hot gun barrels. This was the test, and the Quad 50 had passed with terrifying colors. But the true impact of this weapon went far beyond the physical body count. It began to erode the spiritual foundation of the Japanese Imperial Army. The news of the monster weapon spread through the Japanese lines like a contagion. They had names for it: the Iron Devil, the Thunder God, or simply the Meat Chopper. For the average Japanese soldier, death in battle was expected, even welcomed as a path to honor. To die by the sword or a well-placed rifle shot was warrior's death. But to be annihilated by a machine that turned existence into a spray of biological matter, there was no honor in that. It was an industrial erasure of the self. The psychological devastation became most apparent during the battles for the fortified caves and ridges, specifically around the hellscape of Hill 212. Here, the Japanese had dug into limestone caves, creating formidable bunkers that were immune to artillery and mortar fire. American infantry squads were being chewed up trying to clear these positions with flamethrowers and satchel charges. The commanders called up the M16. The half-tracks maneuvered up the steep, muddy slopes, their tracks churning for grip, until they had a direct line of sight into the cave mouths. The gunners didn't just fire at the enemy soldiers, they fired at the architecture. The Quad 50s unleashed sustained bursts directly into the cave openings. The result was a horrific lesson in ballistics. The heavy rounds struck the rear walls of the caves and shattered the rock, turning the stone itself into lethal shrapnel. The bullets ricocheted wildly in the confined spaces, creating a blender effect of lead and limestone. The noise inside the caves would have been beyond human comprehension. A sonic pressure capable of rupturing eardrums and liquefying internal organs. Japanese soldiers who were not hit by bullets were often found dead with no visible wounds, killed by the sheer concussive overpressure, or buried alive as the structural integrity of the cave entrances collapsed under the hammering of the heavy rounds. It was here, in the aftermath of the Hill 212 engagements, that American intelligence officers began to notice a startling anomaly. Japanese soldiers were surrendering. Not in the ones or twos that were occasionally seen, but in groups. This was unprecedented. The code of Bushido dictated suicide before capture. But the Quad 50 had broken that conditioning. When interrogated, trembling prisoners of war confessed that they could not fight the Thunder Wagons. They could fight men, they could fight tanks, but they could not fight a weapon that denied them the chance to even die like men. The Quad 50 had stripped away the romance of sacrifice, leaving only the cold, hard reality of meaningless annihilation. It forced the Japanese soldier to confront the futility of his doctrine in the face of superior industrial slaughter. However, the story of the M16 Halftrack is not just a story of triumph. It is a story of trauma that cut both ways. If you are finding this deep dive into the realities of military history compelling, please take a second to hit that like button. It helps us bring more of these untold stories to light. The legacy of the Quad 50 in Luzon left a scar on the men who operated it. We often think of the victors as being immune to the horrors they inflict. But the crews of the M16s were deeply affected by the carnage they created. Diaries and after-action reports from the 209th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion and other units describe a strange, hollow feeling among the gunners. They weren't engaging in combat in the traditional sense. They were operators of a slaughterhouse. The physical sensation of firing the weapon, the vibration that rattled the bones, the toxic fumes of thousands of spent casings, the visual nightmare of what remained of the enemy led to severe cases of combat stress reaction. One gunner, whose name has been lost to history but whose words echo in the archives, described the feeling of his hands shaking uncontrollably hours after a battle, not from fear, but from the relentless vibration of the spade grips. He wrote of the terrible power he held, a power that felt too great for one man to wield. They saw the enemy not as soldiers, but as raw material being processed by their machines. This disassociation, this mechanization of death was a precursor to the psychological burdens of modern remote warfare. The Quad 50 crews had to live with the memory of the red mist, a haunting image that no metal could erase. In the broader scope of military history, the use of the M16 Halftrack in the Philippines marked a pivotal transition. It demonstrated the terrifying efficacy of converting anti-air assets for ground support, a tactic that would be seen again in Korea and Vietnam, with the Duster and the Vulcan cannon. But more importantly, it proved that there was a breaking point for even the most fanatical indoctrination. The Bushido spirit, forged in centuries of tradition and hardened by years of war, was ultimately brittle. It could withstand pain, starvation, and fear, but it shattered under the sheer, unfeeling weight of American firepower. By the time the Luzon campaign officially ended in July 1945, over 200,000 Japanese soldiers had perished, many of them cut down by the relentless hammering of the Quad 50s. The weapon that was designed to protect the skies had conquered the ground, leaving a legacy of efficiency that was as impressive as it was gruesome. The M16 Halftrack remains a symbol of the moment warfare ceased to be a contest of warriors and fully became a contest of machines, where technology didn't just kill the enemy, it dismantled their very soul. As we look back on the terrifying innovation of the Quad 50, we are reminded that the most effective weapons are often those that attack the mind as violently as they attack the body. If you want to see more analyses of the tactics that define the 20th century, make sure to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell right now. You do not want to miss our upcoming video on the secret weapon that broke the stalemate in Europe. Thank you for watching, and keep history alive.